Are you in a universe which is ruled by natural laws and therefore is stable, firm, absolute, and knowable? Or are you in an incomprehensible chaos, a realm of inexplicable miracles, an unpredictable, unknowable flux, which your mind is impotent to grasp? Are the things you see around you real, or are they only an illusion? Do they exist independent of any observer, or are they created by the observer? These answers are the province of metaphysics, the study of existence as such, or, in Aristotle's words, of being qua being, the basic branch of philosophy.
Today we're going to be discussing the 10 top issues regarding Ayn Rand, and I'll intro it in a second, but let's first jump right in and talk about number 10, which is Nietzsche. She was a fan of Nietzsche when she was young. Nietzsche approached reality in a brute sense, which means we have to accept reality as it is in our existence, which means temporal, short, not always good, not always satisfying. And we have to approach life as it is. And this kind of absolute theory of dealing with things as they are was really what created existentialism. What's interesting about Rand's critique when she broke with Nietzsche is that what it lacked when you really read Rand is a kind of optimism, because Nietzsche was anything but optimistic about just the nature of and the vicissitudes of your existence. Now, Nietzsche did end up being optimistic about some stuff, just like Freud did, but that's another topic. In terms of the reality of our existence, Nietzsche became very much what we now call existentialist, which is we have to accept what we're dealt. And so even though that sounds like what Rand would appreciate, and it must have been what she liked about Nietzsche in the early part of her life when she was reading him and building her philosophy, in no small way based on him and his genealogy, which means she took from Nietzsche this idea about the language game, that people used words to manipulate language and then ultimately to manipulate the history, to manipulate our culture in the sense that we change what the word selfish means. So Nietzsche said we changed what the word good means. And so she saw herself in Nietzsche when she was young, but pretty quickly in her 20s, she did not. And she called him a brute. So Rand said, and I quote, "Laissez-faire capitalism is where men deal with one another, not as master and slave, but as free traders." So that comes from the book that we're going to be talking about, which is The Voice of Reason. Actually, I can probably show it to you if my light doesn't mess it up. We see what she's saying, and it is idealistic, and it is actually more optimistic than you'd expect. And it is that given the right circumstance, men could trade equally. And this is a discussion of economy. But if you take that to mean real life, you see that what she's saying is that men deal with each other fairly. And what Nietzsche, at least what she took from Nietzsche as she got older, was that the master slave of the Nietzsche cultural explanation is that some people will always be slaves and some will always be masters. And this is what she calls, too brute. And she calls him a brute and she dismisses him at that point. So I did want to back up and say as an intro that we're talking about Ayn Rand. She's a novelist and a philosopher. What's interesting about her as a philosopher is that she's one of the most hated thinkers. She should probably be called a thinker and not a philosopher. She broke completely with all of academic philosophy. She even wrote an essay where she broke down every major philosopher and made fun of them. And the reason she did this is because she believes they all have a common theme. And then she tried to subjectivism, basically. And she tried to make the argument that there's another theme inherent in Aristotle, which does come up time and time again because people need it. It is, in fact, probably for her what invented science. And it is what gives us success today. And yet it is the thing that's ridiculed. And what's interesting is that's what happened to her, is she got ridiculed. So there's a lot of stories about Rand. My story is that when I was in academic philosophy, one of the Rand groups wanted to put a Rand professor into our program, and they do that by offering money, a stipend to the department, I guess is what it's called. It was like $150,000. And then she can teach other things, but they do have as their specialty Ayn Rand. And so that was not met well at Texas State. Southwest at the time. They were super mad. And so you can hear the argument on both sides. One, that she's biased, but the other side is that she has a specialty. All professors have a specialty. So it does seem like there's a little bit control and intentionality and design built into why you would pay to have a professor put in. But on the other side, she was dismissed, and sometimes for no good reason. And to overcome that dismissal, they had to have more marketing for Rand as an academic. And it never really took. They do have Rand professors, and there are people that are specialists. And there's actually a Rand, at least there was, a really well-respected Rand professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who I never met, even though I was a Rand specialist, supposedly. So we are talking about Rand. A lot of people that encounter her only read her fiction, only know her novels, The Fountainhead, which is maybe the most famous because it's shorter, which is from 1943. But Atlas Shrugged in 1957 may have had a bigger impact, which is to say the main character, John Galt, you still see him today, streets named after him, bumper stickers, movements, everything about John Galt, who was a character in Atlas Shrugged who went against the system. We are a common sense philosophy channel, which means we accept things a priori in a different way than critical philosophers do. And so what's interesting about Rand relative to our channel is that the argument can be made that Rand was dismissed because she was common sense. She would not say that. I've never seen her say that. I don't know that she even read Thomas Reid, who would have been the clear academic she would have read, and some of the people since then, like G.E. Moore, that discuss that same kind of naturalism or acceptance of a priori principles or Aristotelianism in that sense. So there's definitely a relationship between Rand and common sense, and it may be the relationship that got her dismissed overall, not just as an academic, not just as a philosopher, but as a thinker. And so now she's lumped in with the right-wing Trumpers because she was such a capitalist that she would say things that can now be taken out of context today to be similar to Trump ideas about hands-off government, which really isn't a bad idea, the size of the government, making it smaller, which is not really a bad idea, et cetera, et cetera. So let's move on to the top 10 issues. We talked about her relationship with Nietzsche's ideas and how she liked them and then didn't like them, and how, and again, I want to make this comment, Nietzsche is seen as a subjectivist. I don't believe that he is. He really does say both things, which is what Nietzsche does. He's more paradoxical and explorative and polyphonic than he is amenable to being put in a nutshell. And so it does sound a little confusing whenever you talk about Nietzsche. But in this sense, she thought he was one of the brutes. She categorized people into brutes and priests and creators in some sense. And so she ended up not liking him. So the number 9 issue with Ayn Rand is virtue ethics and thinking versus action. So what that means is that she believed there's a big difference between just thinking about something and actually doing it. And virtue ethics is the ethical expression of this concept. Virtue ethics is about doing and creating an objective ethics that already exists. And so by doing the things, you become ethical. And so this plays right into what you see Rand saying about ethics, because her whole point was there is no way to argue about the subjectivity of ethics because it just is. Very common sense thing to say. And it does relate back to thinking versus action, which is very much a thing that Thomas Reid discussed. Number 8, her optimism. Rand, for all her vitriol and dogmatism and anger, which did get her in trouble, nobody gets more ad hominem attacks than poor Ayn Rand, which means when people attack her, they say, well, she smoked. Well, she cheated on her husband. She did all those things. And that is ad hominem. That is a fallacy. Her philosophy and her objectivism actually portrayed much more of an optimism. And it was a kind of American equality. Everyone has the ability to do A, B, and C. And you can see how this would clash with one of the interpretations of Nietzsche, probably the predominant one, which is that he didn't believe people were equal. So let me read you a quote. The majority of men use only a small part of their potential intellectual capacity. And that's from chapter 6, titled Altruism as Appeasement. All her chapters sound like that. And so you see in this the kind of expectation philosophically that A, innate ideas, intellectuality is built in, not blank slate necessarily, even though she would probably argue that all people are built with the ability to become philosophers and they need to be redirected. And that was everywhere in Rand's writing. To me, that doesn't conflict with Nietzsche's idea of the Superman, but I do see how he can be taken as looking at men as not equal. Again, paradoxical, not the same. Number 7 is her relationship with common sense. So we don't know that she had an overt relationship with common sense. We don't know that she read Thomas Reid. I don't see anywhere in her writing, and I've read everything, and I do forget things, but I didn't see anywhere where she references common sense or a critical type common sense. Got to remember, common sense was vulgar common sense in the 18th century, which means things like people thinking the world is flat, your first intuition. A lot of times that's wrong. But in philosophy, a more critical examination like Thomas Reid suggests that things are absolute, reality is real, things can be talked about in the sense that they're real. You have to examine your premises based on absolute naturalistic fundamentals, which is what Ayn Rand did with ethics. We'll get to that. Number 6 is the word selfish. So this has been the linchpin for her, for the perception of her in our world. And it is that she suggests the word selfish is a virtue, is a good thing. How does she suggest that? In a Nietzschean way, she says the word has been misused, misinterpreted, misdefined. So for her, selfishness means rational self-interest. You should still be able to use the word selfish, but she understands it comes with a negative connotation. There's a bunch of quotes about this that I'm not going to read to you, but I am going to read you this quote. The equation of selfishness with evil has caused the arrested moral development of mankind and needs to be rejected. You can see that's part of the language game complaint, but it's also this idea that there's a better definition, which for her actually takes an elaboration, which is why you could actually value Rand, because I can make a more elaborate argument, which is that if you look at the word self-focused in philosophy, you will find examples in real life how you could defend such a claim, which is that selfishness is a simple concept, that you only focus on the self. Rational self-interest can mean a focus on the self benefits others. I know that's fairly complicated and counterintuitive because you live in the language game, but the idea is that if I only focused on myself and only me, I could invent the cure for cancer. So you see how a self-focus doesn't necessarily eliminate the idea that you can help people. That's number 6. Number 5, I wrote down nothing, so we're going to skip it. Number 4, clear, concise expressions of your own personal philosophy. This was a huge thing for her. She felt like the history of philosophy was discursive, obfuscated, and useless. And there have been people that have said that, definitely me. And I will say that a perfect example of that is her being asked at a writers' conference to explain her complete thought system and philosophy while standing on one foot, which is to say within 10 seconds. And so she said, metaphysics, reality, epistemology, reason, ethics. I can never read my own writing. Ethics, rational self-interest, and politics, capitalism. And then she got off her one foot. So you can see how she's putting an emphasis on clarity. And if you read the first paragraph of Thomas Reid's inquiry, you will find that exact thing. I believe that's where it is. Again, don't have it in front of me. I never do. I'm unsystematic. But one of Reid's most quoted sentences was that the lack of clarity in philosophy is one of the largest problems in A, philosophy, and B, the acceptance of philosophy. Again, a relationship with a simpler philosophy, a Stoic, Socratic concept of innate ideas, things are as they are, A equals A, this kind of thing. Number 3, culture value deprivation. This is actually the name of a chapter, chapter 11 in The Voice of Reason. And this is all about how, as a culture, we've lost our sense of value. In a sense, we don't understand the concept. She defines value. She defines subjectivism, the idea that all things are equal. If all things are equal, nothing can actually have value. This is at the core of common sense philosophy. It's at the core of Ayn Rand's thinking and objectivism. Once you start to accept that no value is possible, if that's what you accept, you also don't believe in reality and don't believe you can act. And so then you become lethargic, and then you get rid of any kind of built-in intellectual ability that you used to have. And you got to remember, when Nietzsche said God is dead, this is what he meant. He didn't mean God is dead. He meant that society was starting to lose value. which means he was criticizing subjectivism, which means if you look at some of these things outside of academic philosophy, you see relationships that most people would not tell you exist. Number 2, is ethics a science? So she has a whole essay on this, that it's who's the final authority in ethics. Thank God I have the chapter. As an ethics teacher, I can tell you the biggest problem was trying to convince students in the very beginning that there is a way to place a value on an ethical system, which means eventually you can find right and you can find wrong, a deontological ethics at least, from Kant. The dominant theory, especially nowadays, influenced by academic philosophy over hundreds of years, has been Hume's idea that ethics is just whimsical, that is just based on emotion. So let me read this really quick from chapter 4, who is the final authority on ethics. Quote, there are certain questions that must be questioned, that is challenged at the root, because they consist of smuggling a false premise into the mind of a careless listener. Who created the universe is one such question. Very common sense. Do you still beat your wife is another smuggled premise. And so is the question above, who is the final authority in ethics? It comes up in many ways, directly and indirectly. It usually asks in some formulation, such as who decides what is right and wrong. Students of objectivism are not likely to ask this question. It is obvious that the root of such questions is a certain kind of conceptual vacuum, the absence of the concept of objectivity in the questioner's mind, which means they don't truly believe that right and wrong are even possible. And so I hope you see that's how she portrays an objectivity in ethics. She hates Kant. So I would have thought, like, if I came to this planet, which I did as an alien, but I can't tell you that, I have to pretend like I'm human. If I did come here completely unaware and I sat down with Kant and I sat down with Rand, I would think they were the same person. She's so mad at him, maybe because she sees herself in him. I don't know, but he was pushing for that kind of objectivity. Sorry. I mean, I can't be talked out of that. Number 1 issue to discuss with Ayn Rand is the disconnect between reality and mental life. So she was really mad at Hume as well as Kant. And that anger came from the subjectivism inherent in the perception theories. So those theories are that your mind doesn't actually perceive reality. So for her, again, that whole process of selling a disconnect between mind and reality builds in people a subjectivism, builds in people a lethargy, a lack of concern for even going out and exploring the world because it's not there. And so I've been saying this for so long. And there's such a link between that theory and Thomas Reid. And so Rand's point is that that disconnect leads you down the wrong path. And that from Aristotle, we can build a personal philosophy and then add to that. But what must be included in that is a relationship with reality that includes action, that includes virtue ethics system, which includes value and the personal esteem, which is what she often says, that comes from building the relationship with the right thing, getting the rewards from the relationship, and being successful, like Howard Rourke was in The Fountainhead, her hero, The Fountainhead, who was constantly creating because of what he valued about himself and the abilities he gave himself, creating for others the beauty of architecture. And most importantly about that book, how others reacted to him. So those are the 10 issues. This is definitely a summation. I could go on for 3 hours about any one of these, what ended up being 9 topics. But I hope as an intro, you see how Rand can be discussed. So that's Ayn Rand. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.